What if I told you we're living among the ruins of a lost civilization? Not one from thousands of years ago, but an empire that was thriving just a few centuries back, a global empire with technology that might have even rivaled or surpassed our own. We're talking magnificent cities, advanced energy grids, and a single culture that stretched from continent to continent. And what if that empire was wiped off the face of the earth in some kind of mysterious cataclysm? Its cities buried, its people scattered, and its memories deliberately scrubbed from our history books by a powerful group that rewrote the past to fit their own narrative. It sounds like a sci-fi movie plot, but for a growing corner of the internet, this isn't fiction. They believe this lost civilization was very real. They call it the Great Tartarian Empire. The evidence they claim is hiding in plain sight. It's in the architecture of our oldest, grandest buildings. It's on strange ancient maps, and it's literally in the ground beneath our feet, which they believe is hiding the first floors of a completely buried world that has been long forgotten. Now, we've been told these are just all wild conspiracy theories, but the pictures they show you are bizarre, and they raise some fascinating questions. Today, I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I'm here to do what we always do: follow the breadcrumbs and ask the questions that nobody else is. We're going on a journey to explore the case of the Tartarian Empire, looking at the claims, the weird anomalies, and the official explanations to try and separate fact from fiction. What's real and what's a modern myth? And the answer might be a lot more complex than you think. But before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're a fan of the strange, mysterious, weird conspiracy corner of the internet, because that's what we do here. We talk about the weird stuff that nobody else really talks about, so let's get into it. So, what exactly is the Tartarian Empire theory? If you've spent any time on certain parts of YouTube, TikTok, or Reddit, you've probably seen the images, grand ornate buildings from the 1800s that just seem impossibly majestic, old world maps showing a huge territory labeled Tartari. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know how to say it. Tartary sounds a little weird, but Tartari sounds a little, I don't know where I'm going here. The fact is, if you look today and you see all the buildings, all the new homes that we're constructing, they're just wood and plastic, vinyl. There's nothing grand, majestic about them. They're all cookie cutter. But then if you look at the old buildings of the 1800s and these epic stone buildings that were way high with 15-foot tall vaulted ceilings, it just looks impossible. But the story they tell is as epic as the empire it describes. Photos of the streets where the windows and doors of old buildings literally seem to be sinking into the sidewalk. The story they tell is as epic as the empire it describes. The idea is that in the not so distant past, maybe as recently as the 19th century, most of the world was united under a single advanced civilization. And we're not talking ancient aliens, we're talking Tartaria. This empire was supposedly a beacon of peace and technology. Its citizens lived in harmony, enjoying things like free atmospheric energy, kind of like Nikola Tesla tried to give, which they harnessed with the intricate spires and domes of the buildings, kind of like what we have seen recently with the Great Pyramids. The architecture, which we now call neoclassical, the style you see in old city halls and state capitals around the world, wasn't a revival. According to the theory, it was just the standard, unified building style of the Tartarian Empire. From San Francisco to St. Petersburg, from Melbourne to Mumbai, these incredible buildings are supposedly the last remnants of this global civilization. They weren't built by our primitive ancestors with horses and buggies and, carrying these big bricks up gigantic areas. They were inherited. But then, something happened, a catastrophe. Believers call it the Great Mud Flood, which is not a euphemism for shitting your pants. It was either a natural or man-made event, and it covered the world in a sea of mud, burying the Tartarian cities up to their first, second, or even third floors. This event supposedly wiped out most of the population, leaving just scattered survivors. And this is where the cover-up starts. The theory claims a new group of global elites, maybe the same people who caused the cataclysm, rose to power. They took control, rounded up the orphan survivors, and started the massive project of erasing Tartaria from our history. They allegedly destroyed the records, edited maps, and invented a fake history of separate nations in slow, painful progress. The grand Tartarian buildings that were left were either torn down or repurposed. Their true origins were hidden. Events like the World's Fairs of the late 19th century are seen not as contemporary exhibits, but but is the unveiling of the scavenged Tartarian cities, which were then destroyed to hide the truth. Some even reframe World War I and World War II as the final mopping up operations to destroy the last traces of this old empire. It's a breathtaking story, a lost golden age, a terrible disaster, and the biggest cover-up in human history. Its main appeal is that it offers one single explanation for all sorts of historical oddities. It asks us to believe that history as we know it is a lie. But to start our investigation, we have to look at the first piece of evidence they always point to: the maps. For believers in the Tartarian theory, the smoking gun is hiding in plain sight on centuries-old maps. If you look at maps of Asia drawn by European cartographers from the 16th to the 19th century, you'll find it, a vast, sprawling territory, often bigger than any other country, labeled Tartari. Sometimes it's Great Tartary, other times Tartaria Magna. It stretches from the Caspian Sea across Siberia and deep into what is now China and Mongolia. Proponents ask a simple question: why would map makers for hundreds of years carefully draw and label a massive empire on their maps if it just simply didn't exist? These maps aren't forgeries, they're real historical documents sitting in libraries and university collections. Some theorists, however, go further, claiming certain maps show detailed cities and borders, proving it was a well-established country. They point out that it wasn't just some vague placeholder. It was a known, powerful place. The fact that Tartari disappears from the maps in the late 19th century is presented as the final proof. As the new powers took over, they systematically erased the name from all new maps, replacing it with Russia, Siberia, and China. The empire, they claim, was wiped not just off the land, but off the paper that it was drawn on. And that is a powerful piece of the puzzle. How could an empire so large, so prominent, so magnificent just vanish? Well, this is where historians and map experts offer a very different explanation. They argue it was a complete misunderstanding of how the early maps were made. The reality, they say, is that Tartari was never a unified empire at all. It was a European label, born out of ignorance, not knowledge. So these people that just, all these years ago drew out this map of this huge continent that they supposedly traversed, it's just a fairy tale. It didn't really exist. But for centuries, European knowledge of Central and Northern Asia was incredibly limited. They knew it was a huge, expansive land filled with nomadic groups, many of them Turkish and Mongol peoples. The word Tartar itself was a catch-all phrase Europeans had used since the Mongol invasion of the 13th century to describe these distant, poorly understood people. So naturally, when cartographers sat down to draw the world, they had a giant blank space on their map with no real political information. They just used the blanket term Tartari to fill it. It was basically the historical equivalent of writing "Here be dragons," or, I don't know, some unicorns or aliens are over here. As European knowledge slowly improved, the term got more specific. Mapmakers started dividing the region. Areas under Russian control became Russian Tartari. Parts influenced by China were labeled Chinese Tartari. The parts still run by the local Khans were called independent Tartari. The name itself wasn't a sign of a single empire, but it was a label for diverse regions that Europeans were just beginning to understand. So why did the name disappear? Not because of a conspiracy, but because it was replaced with better information. As Russia expanded and mapmaking became more scientific, vague terms like Tartari became obsolete. They were replaced with precise names like Siberia, Central Asia, and Kazakhstan. The erasing wasn't really a cover-up, it was just the natural progress of cartography. The maps weren't showing a single lost global empire, they were documenting the slow retreat of European ignorance. And while the maps are a cornerstone of the theory, the most eye-catching evidence is the mud flood. The idea is that the world we see is built directly on top of an older, buried one, and the proof, they say, is in nearly every town and city on Earth. Go to the historic downtown of any major city. Look at the old 19th century buildings, and you might notice something a little weird. You'll see windows that are halfway buried into the sidewalk. You'll find huge doorways that seem to open right into the ground, with a smaller and much newer door built inside the frame. You'll see beautiful arched windows on what is now the basement level, looking like they were once the ground floor. The proponents of this conspiracy theory claim is the undeniable proof of the mud flood, a global cataclysm of mud and dirt that buried the original ground level of the great Tartarian cities. The survivors, or the new inheritors, simply dug out what they could and made a new street level on top of several feet of mud, and repurposed the tops of these half-buried buildings. The photos are everywhere online. Pictures from the 19th century seem to show massive excavation projects in cities all over the world, which are now interpreted not as new construction, but as digging out. A favorite example is the Salt Lake Temple in Utah. Photos from its construction are used as proof that these builders weren't starting from scratch, but were unearthing the foundations of a much older building. They point to the high quality of the stonework deep in the pit as evidence that this was a finished part of a buried structure. The narrative is powerful because it seems so intuitive. You see a window in the ground and you think, nobody builds a building like that. Your common sense is screaming that something is wrong. The mud flood theory provides a simple yet dramatic answer. However, once again, historians and architects offer a much more mundane but thoroughly documented explanation. The phenomenon of buried ground floors is real, but it's not from a single disaster. It's the results of centuries of slow, gradual urban development. Think about how cities grow. Before modern paving and sewer systems, streets were just dirt or cobblestone. When they got worn out, the easiest solution wasn't to dig them up, it was just to add a new layer on top. Over decades and centuries of new paving, dirt, and debris, the street level naturally rises. What was once the ground floor of a building slowly becomes its basement. This is a process called urban accretion, where cities installed things like sewer lines, water mains, and later electrical cables. They were often laid on top of the old street level, and then the street was built up over them. This also explains the strange windows and doors. The submerged windows were once ground level windows that became what are known as areaway windows, set into a light well to let some sun into the new basement. The large buried archways were often original carriage gates that were later filled in and replaced with smaller doors at the new, higher street level. And the Salt Lake Temple photos? The construction records are meticulous. They show what's being called a dig out is actually just a standard massive excavation for the temple's incredibly deep and strong foundations. The high quality stonework at the bottom was the beginning of the foundation walls, built by master stonemasons from the ground up, all documented in daily journals, and there's just no evidence of any pre-existing buildings. The reality is often less dramatic, a story of slow incremental changes of cities burying their own past layer by layer. But if the mud flood buried the Tartarian world, then the buildings are just its most glorious testament. The next layer of the theory is the architecture itself. Proponents argue that all around the world we see a style of building so uniform and complex that it defies the official story of how it was made. They point to the great star forts found across the globe. These complex star-shaped fortifications, they claim, are too geometrically perfect and too widespread to have been designed by different cultures independently. You have to think, when these were built, we had no internet. We had civilizations that existed independently of each other, but yet they somehow all built things with the same structure. They suggest these weren't just for defenses, but they were maybe energy hubs, their shapes designed to harness the Earth's natural energy. Then there's the civic architecture. The city halls, courthouses, and post offices built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From the Paris Opera House to the government buildings of Buenos Aires, they share a common language: soaring domes, majestic columns, and interesting buildings. The theory asks, how did builders in the age of horse and steam all over the world suddenly start building this same advanced style all over the world? Were they all just coincidentally obsessed with ancient Rome? Or were they all trying to copy the technology of a single global predecessor? This leads to the idea that these buildings were more than just pretty. The spires on cathedrals weren't just decorative. They were antennas for harvesting atmospheric energy. The great domes were resonant chambers. The whole building was part of this wireless free energy grid, and the shift to fossil fuels wasn't progress. It was a deliberate move to enslave humanity with metered energy. And we all know, if you've ever looked into Nikola Tesla, he tried to make this energy source available for the whole world, and we see how that ended. They present photos of these buildings under construction as more proof. The sheer scale seems to be impossible for the time. They claim many photos don't show construction at all, but repair of existing ancient structures. Once again, the historical record provides detailed, if less fantastical, answers. The shared architectural style is real, but it wasn't a lost empire. It was the result of two things: colonialism and the printing press. The 19th century was the height of European empires, and styles like neoclassicism were seen as symbols of power and civilization. As empires expanded, they exported their architecture to build their administrative centers. At the same time, the architectural pattern, books and journals were being printed and sent all over the world, allowing an architect in America or Australia to build in the same style that was fashionable in Paris. It wasn't a mystery, it was just a global trend. Just like modern skyscrapers look the same everywhere today. But what about the impossible construction? While it is impressive, the methods were well documented. Human ingenuity with levers, pulleys, cranes, and steam power, plus a massive labor force, was more than capable of making these constructions. Detailed construction photos and blueprints exist for most of these buildings, showing them being built from the ground up. The oversized doors and high ceilings weren't for giants. They were design choices meant to inspire awe and improve air circulation before AC was a thing. The claims of antique tech are pure speculation. The metallic spires on old buildings were just often decorative, or they were lightning rods, a technology invented by Benjamin Franklin to protect buildings from lightning, not harvest it. There's absolutely no evidence these buildings ever generated any power. And for the star forts, they were designed in the 16th century Italy to solve a specific military problem: cannons. The star shape was a geometric innovation that eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to create interlocking fields of fire. Their design was spread around the world through military engineers, not an ancient energy grid. Finally, the World's Fairs. Evidence that buildings were temporary is overwhelming. They were built on a budget and a deadline. Using staff, a mix of plastic and fiber over wooden frames, was the only way to create such a grand illusion quickly and cheaply. The whole point of a flare is that it's temporary. Building them and tearing them down wasn't a cover-up. It was actually the plan for the start. Civilization is nothing without its people, and the Tartarian theory populates its lost world with beings as grand as its architecture: the giants. This offshoot suggests the original Tartarians were a race of giant humans, maybe 8 or even 12 feet tall. The evidence includes the oversized doorways and high ceilings of the old world buildings claimed to be designed for a much larger being. Proponents also scour the internet for old photos, some showing supposed giant skeletons being unearthed, often linked to the sensational newspaper reports from the 19th century. Others are just old photos where tricks of perspective make someone look naturally enlarged. Think somebody standing very close in frame with a large building behind them, and it makes them appear taller than they actually are. The giant story connects to the mud flood. The flood wiped out these gentle giants, and who replaced them? This is where the theory co-ops a real and tragic piece of American history: the orphan trains. From the 1850s to the 1920s, the orphan train movement relocated an estimated 200,000 children from crowded East Coast cities to families in the rural Midwest. The official history is that these were children who were orphaned, abandoned, or living in extreme poverty, and the program was a flawed attempt to give them a better life. The Tartarian theory offers a more sinister interpretation. It claims these were the last surviving children of the Tartarian civilization, rounded up after the mud flood. Their memories were wiped and their true parents were hidden, and they were shipped out to be reprogrammed and repopulate the empty cities. The orphan trains in this story were a tool for a great reset. Now, this part of the theory is powerful because it preys on our natural empathy. The image of giant skeletons and train cars full of sad children creates a deeply emotional story. However, these claims crumble under scrutiny. The evidence for giant humans is non-existent in the archaeological record. The giant skeleton photos that circulate online are almost all either outright hoaxes or misidentifications of mammoth bones. 19th century newspaper articles reporting these findings were the clickbait of their day, known for printing rumors just to sell their papers. None have ever been verified. The reinterpretation of the orphan trains is a particularly gross distortion of human history. The orphan train movement is a complex and well-documented social event. We have extensive records, letters from the children themselves, and detailed histories of the urban poverty that led to this crisis. It was a response, however flawed, to a very real problem. There's absolutely no evidence connecting it to a mythical cataclysm. It's a case of taking a real historical event and grafting a baseless conspiracy into it. And this brings us to the grand finale of the video. The why. Why would this incredible empire be erased? The theory provides a simple answer: the Great Reset. The idea is that the group destroyed Tartaria did so to replace its harmonious society with the corrupt, controlled world we live in today. They replaced free energy with polluting fossil fuels. They replaced a unified world culture with warning nations to create perpetual conflict. They replaced the truth with a fake history to keep everybody ignorant. Even a declassified CIA document from 1957 that mentions the Soviet effort to suppress the ethnic identity of modern Tartar people is the cherry-picked proof of this global conspiracy. So, we've gone through the claims, we've looked at the documents and the historical explanations. The evidence for a global advanced Tartarian empire, a worldwide mud flood, and the deliberate cover-up just doesn't hold up. The theory is built on misreading maps, misunderstanding how cities grow, and misrepresenting architectural history. Scholars trace the origin of this specific conspiracy not to ancient text, but to online forums in the 2010s, with roots in Russian nationalist pseudo-history. But this leads to the biggest question of them all. If it's not true, why is it so popular? What is it about the story of Tartaria that connects with so many people right now? The answer may be that the Tartarian theory really isn't about history. It's about the present. It taps into a deep and growing distrust of official stories and institutions. It gives a voice to the feeling that the world, as it's presented to us, doesn't quite make sense. We look at all the things going around right now with the files, the war, aliens, everything that we've known to be true unraveling and showing as a lie, and it sparks a question. What if Tartaria is really just another cover-up? What if it really does explain all the grand buildings, the ancient advancements that were way ahead of their time? And what if it's true? We may never know. And that's where you have to use your brain and critically think and decide for yourself. Is this something that logically makes sense? Or are you just chasing at loose threads here? That choice is yours to make. You can do the research yourself. You can look into everything that I've presented to you today and come to your own conclusion. I'm not here to say if it's real or fake. I'm here to give you a critical thinking exercise